It's all about gouache in this episode of Art That Plays and Praise. Hi, this is Ginger, and this is what I'll paint today. I found out that not everybody knows what gouache is. Until just a few years ago, neither did I. So let's talk about it. What is gouache? And while we're at it, let me review a jelly gouache brand and demonstrate through an actual illustration what it's capable of doing. Let me just put it out there that this is not a sponsored review. Just like all the product reviews in this channel, I bought these supplies myself and I have nothing to gain from promoting or criticizing it. So all the opinions are my own, which you may or may not agree with. Okay, I'm glad that preliminary is out of the way. I'll be honest with you, I didn't like working with gouache before because the set I had came in a tube and I found it too time consuming to squeeze out pigments every single time. And then there was the trouble of determining how much paint to squeeze out for the project I had because it would be too wasteful to squirt out a lot of gouache in a palette only to find out later that I don't really need all of them. But my love for gouache surfaced when I found this jelly tub set up from Himi or Mia. This packaging is so innovative and convenient. Just peel away the cover from every tub and you're good to go. The 24 tub set I have here has enough color representation to give you a variety of tints, tones, and shades. Each jelly cup has 30 ml of paint, so that definitely will go a long way before you'll need to replenish your supplies. The gouache cups have tiny lift tabs to help you peel away the packaging. I find it a bit messy to open them, but that's fine. The Himi package comes with its own brushes, but honestly, the brushes are not that great. The brush compartment though is big enough to accommodate your own brush, whatever you prefer to use. This 24-piece set also has its own palette for mixing, and it comes with a cover you can just clasp shut. It looks portable, but this is not really the kind of set you'll want to do plein air paintings with because it's heavy, it's very heavy. The 56-piece set of it obviously is way heavier, so even if it has a handle and the cover to make this portable, I still wouldn't carry it by the handle because you might risk breaking the clasps and throwing open all the jelly cups during transport. You might be wondering why one gouache set has Himi on the cover while the other is Mia. Both of these are made by the same company and both paints are basically the same. Himi and Mia Gouache are both manufactured by the same Chinese company. It's called Mia Stationery, and these are fairly new, developed only in 2011. I don't know why they made a distinction in brand name, but everything is the same except of course the number of colors you get in each set. I don't particularly enjoy swatching, so I'm glad the bigger set has a color reference chart already included. The easiest way to define gouache is by describing what it looks like. Gouache is like a cross product between watercolor and acrylic. It releases pigments through the use of water just like watercolor, but it is more opaque, just like acrylic paint. Gouache is of a thicker viscosity compared to watercolor, so it is best used on heavy gauge paper. For this painting, I chose Arch rough paper, and it has 300 GSM. You can also use hot pressed or cold pressed paper or even illustration boards. Since gouache is an opaque medium, it can be used on any colored paper, not just white. Now, just like watercolor, the more water you add to gouache, the more translucent the pigments become. You can apply gouache as a thick paint with little water, or you can apply only a little paint with lots of water, and it's that versatile. But one word of warning, you can't apply gouache in such a chunky manner like you do with maybe acrylic or oil paints. If you slather too thick of a gouache paint, you'll run the risk of producing cracks in your art once a painting has dried, so don't do that. One thing about gouache also, it's easy to reactivate dried up pigments by wetting them again. So if you apply chunks of paint on your paper, even when that paint has already dried, you can still touch it up again by passing a wet brush over it. Now the fact that gouache is not water resistant, it may or may not be good news for you. It can work to your advantage if you really intentionally want to change your paint strokes or do over some messy mistakes. But that water solubility can also be bad news if your painting, especially if your painting was already final and you didn't plan to alter anything at all but accidentally spilled water on it. That's a big uh-oh. So take special note. Even dried up gouache can become workable again with only even just a droplet of water. It is prone to water damage, so be warned. One thing I love about gouache is that it's easier to correct or cover up mistakes with this medium, unlike watercolor. Watercolor is somewhat unforgiving. It tends to produce backgrounds or blooms if you apply too much water, or if you want to produce an even wash as background to a painting, you have to pay attention to the timing and make sure your paper doesn't dry out while you're working. With watercolor, you also have to work from light shades first, then apply dark shades later. In other words, there are too many rules and techniques to master with watercolor. On the other hand, with gouache, being an opaque medium, it's easier to paint over mistakes. It's possible to color from light to dark and vice versa from dark to light. You can paint light colors on top of dark ones, as you'll see me do here in this painting. It's easy to build up layers of color without causing a muddy look in your art. But you have to make sure though that your base layer is already dry before painting on top of it, so you don't accidentally create mud. Also, make sure to use a little water only so that the base layer doesn't lift if you don't want it disturbed. This technique is what you'll notice me do while building my blue ocean background here. I tend to go back in again and again and just add touches in the seascape to create depth and texture. Now, this building of layers is something that might be trickier to do with watercolor, but not so with gouache or acrylic. Another thing you may want to know about gouache is you have control over the amount of water to use, like I said, depending on how intense or how translucent you want the colors to be. You can use less water if you want bolder, more opaque colors, or you can thin the pigments with lots of water if you want to produce softer edges or for a more see-through effect. Basically, gouache is similar to acrylic in that it's relatively easy to work with. Upon first opening, this Himi jelly cup looks sufficiently moistened, and the container is sealed enough on the sides to keep that moisture in for a fairly long time. You'll know gouache has dried up when it produces cracks, and this happened to me a few days after I first used my Himi gouache. I tend to leave my cups open and exposed while I'm working, so when I paint the whole day, for instance, the gouache just sits uncovered beside me the whole day. And since I work for several days on every gouache painting, you can imagine that's a whole lot of air exposure, which can easily dry out the gouache, right? But what's amazing about Himi and Mia is that you can always rehydrate dried up paint. We just mist it or put a few drops of water on it and you're back on track. I had dried up paint on my palette and all I did was reactivate them with water and I was able to reuse those pigments. So that was cool because then nothing gets wasted and your paint set can last even if you've stored them for a year or more and the paints have already cracked dry. This cup configuration of Himi makes it easy for you to rehydrate. With my previous gouache set that came in a tube, that was difficult because when paint dried up, I couldn't squeeze anything out of the tube, right? So I ended up just throwing away my dried up paints. If you're a mixed media artist, it might be helpful to note that Himi gouache can also work with colored pencils, fine liners, and markers. I used my Staedtler Tri Plus fine liner in a few places on this art and it worked really well. I applied a few strokes of Prismacolor colored pencils and white gel pen on the fish here and they adhered well. So it's good to know that gouache is versatile and is compatible with other media. It's also possible to mix gouache with watercolor, so if you like to experiment, go ahead. It's safe to do so. Many artists like to paint with watercolor first, then add finer details using gouache. A gouache painting dries to a matte finish. It looks really flat and feels rough and chalky to the touch. This is what differentiates gouache from acrylic. Acrylic paints are a bit more glossy when dry. The truth is I'm not a fan of matte or satin finishes. I always like my art to be a bit shinier, but that's how gouache behaves. If you do know of a brand of gouache that dries to a glossy finish, if there ever is one, I'd like to know what that is. So please leave me a comment below. And last thing I want to say is that gouache reactivates with water, not just when the pigments are on the palette or in your jelly cups, but even when they're already on the paper. This is one difference between gouache and acrylic. Gouache is water soluble even when it has dried. Acrylic is impermeable to water once it's dry. That said, be careful with your finished gouache painting. Some people preserve their gouache art by framing them behind glass. Others use spray fixatives, but you should go easy with the spraying because these fixatives, when overdone, they can drip and run and essentially ruin your hard work. In my case, I was able to safely preserve my art using Dorland's wax medium. Dorland's gave my painting the glossy sheen I really liked. But it also created a minor color shift and it kind of darkened my painting somehow. Alright friends, just to wrap up this review, the short of it is that I like this Himi and Mia gouache. The colors produced are bold and intense. The packaging is convenient and the spread of opened cups makes the paints accessible as I work. Even dried up paint can be reconstituted and used again, so nothing is wasted. This set is sensibly priced, which is awesome. You don't need to spend tons of dollars to create art. This product fits into the budget of many artists, especially beginners. There are no light fastness ratings though. Nothing is available for this gouache, so that to me is a downside. But given the low price point, I wasn't expecting much from it anyway. If you're not sure, you can just buy their smallest 18 color set instead of this 24 or 56 colors. Okay, thanks for being with me in this episode of Art That Plays and Praise. This is Ginger saying God bless you and have fun creating.